Ciao, come va? Buona giornata. Mi chiamo Melrose Teguan, a BS Ed English third year at Northern Bukidnon State College. So today, we're going to discuss about a long narrative Italian poem, which is De la Commedia, Divina Commedia, or the Divine Comedy in English. And of course, Divina Commedia is written during the late medieval period and the early Renaissance period by Dante Alighieri. Dante chose the name Commedia or comedy, and then Boccaccio later on attributed the adjective divina or the divine, and that's the history of the title itself, Divina Commedia. Dante Alighieri, or probably baptized Durante di Alighiero degli Alighieri and often referred to simply as Dante Alighieri, was an Italian poet, writer, and philosopher.
When you think of hell, what images fill your imagination? Your mind might first conjure up a monstrous satanic figure, and then you may further fill in the picture with other beastly devils that roam around torturing damned sinners, who in turn cry out with pain and regrets. And how about the better parts of the Christian afterlife? How do you imagine them? Perhaps the saved are singing songs of joy, angels are fluttering about, and throngs of holy men and women converse and worship God. To some degree, such imaginings have their origins in the Bible. However, in the Christian West, conceptions of the afterlife evolve quite a bit over the centuries. One important late medieval figure who played a key role in shaping the cultural concepts of life after that, even to the present day, is Dante Alighieri, the Florentine poet who was born in the 1260s and died in 1321. In his epic poem known as the Divine Comedy, Dante creates a fictional version of himself who travels through the farthest reaches of hell, the Inferno, the Purgatorio, and Paradise, or the Paradiso. Many details that he describes along this journey have left a lasting impression on the Western imagination for more than half a millennium. In fact, the rather stereotypical images of the afterlife I described earlier are all represented in his work, but Dante also found novel ways to portray already well-formed concepts, thus further solidifying them while also reshaping them into new guises that would become familiar to countless generations that follow. Because of Dante's image-driven descriptions, many artists have sought to illustrate his text through a wide variety of media. Almost immediately after his work was completed, illuminators created images to accompany manuscripts of his masterpiece. And more than 40 illuminated manuscripts of the Divine Comedy were created before the advent of the printing press in the late 15th century. When the potential for faster reproductions of books, including illustrated books, became a reality, Dante's imagination, sometimes intertwined with the imagination of an artist rendering a visual interpretation of his words, reached an even larger audience than before. Dante's years of exile were years of difficult peregrinations from one place to another. As he himself repeatedly says, most effectively in Paradiso in chapter 27. In Kashagueda's moving lamentation, that bitter is the taste of another man's bread, and heavy the way up and down another man's stair. Throughout his exile, nevertheless, Dante was sustained by work on his great poem. The Divine Comedy was possibly begun prior to 1308 and completed just before his death in 1321. But the exact dates are uncertain. In addition, in his final years, Dante was received honorably in many noble houses in the north of Italy, and most notably by Guido Novella da Polinta, the nephew of the remarkable Francesca and Ravenna. There, at his death, Dante was given an honorable burial attended by the leading men of letters of the time, and a funeral oration was delivered by Guido himself. The plot of the Divine Comedy is simple. A man generally assumed to be Dante himself is miraculously unable to undertake an ultramundane journey, which leads him to visit the souls in hell, purgatory, and paradise. He has two guides, Virgil, who leads him through the Inferno and Purgatorio, and Beatrice, who introduces him to Paradiso. And through these fictional encounters taking place from Good Friday evening in 1300 through Easter Sunday and slightly beyond, Dante learns of exile that is awaiting him, which had, of course, already occurred at the time of the writing. These devices allow Dante not only to create a story out of his pending exile, but also to explain the means by which he came to cope with his personal calamity, and to offer suggestions for the resolutions of Italy's troubles as well. Thus, the exile of an individual becomes a microcosm of the problems of the country, and it also becomes representative of the fall of humankind. Dante's story is thus historically specific as well as paradigmatic. So, we have known that Dante himself is not alone, for there are two persons that he encounters. First is Virgil, who leads him through the Inferno and Purgatorio, and then Beatrice, who introduces him to Paradiso. Dante's Inferno differs from its great classical predecessors in both position and purpose. In Homer's Odyssey, Book 12, and Virgil's Aeneid, Book 6, the visit to the land of the dead occurs in the middle of the poem because in this centrally placed books the essential values of life are revealed. Dante, while adopting the convention, transforms the practice by beginning his journey with a visit to the land of the dead. He does this because his poem's spiritually pattern is not classical but Christian. Dante's journey to hell represents the spiritual acts of dying to the world, and hence it coincides with the seasons of Christ's own death. In this way, Dante's method is similar to that of Milton in Paradise Lost, where the flamboyant but defective Lucifer and his fallen angels are presented first. The Inferno represents a false start during which Dante, the character, must be the disabuse of harmful values that somehow prevent him from rising above his fallen world. And despite the regressive nature of the Inferno, Dante's meetings with the rosters of the damned were among the most memorable moments of the poem. The neutrals, the virtuous pagans, Francesca da Rimini, Filippo Argenti, Farinata degli Oberti, Piero delle Vigne, Brunetto Latine, and Simoniacal popes, Ulysses, and Ugolino della Gherardisca imposed themselves upon the reader's imagination with tremendous force. The visit to hell is, as Virgil and later Beatrice explain, an extreme measure, a painful but necessary act before real recovery can begin. This explains why the Inferno is both aesthetically and theologically incomplete. For instance, readers frequently express disappointment at a lack of dramatic or emotional power in the final encounter with Satan in Canto 34. But because of the journey through the Inferno primarily signifies a process of separation and thus is only the initial step in a fuller development, it must end with a distinct anticlimax. In a way, this is inevitable because the final revelation of Satan can have nothing new to offer. The side effects of his presence in human history have already become apparent throughout the Inferno. And in the Purgatorio, the protagonist's painful process of spiritual rehabilitation commences. In fact, this part of the journey may be considered the poem's true moral starting point. Here the pilgrim Dante subdues his own personality in order that he may ascend. In fact, in contrast to the Inferno, where Dante is confronted with a system of models that needs to be discarded, in the Purgatorio, few characters present themselves as models. All of the penitents are pilgrims along the road of life. Dante, rather than being an odd if alienated observer, is an active participant. If the Inferno is a canticle of enforced and involuntary alienation, in which Dante learns how harmful were his former allegiances, in the Purgatorio he comes to accept as most fitting the essential Christian image of life as the pilgrimage. As Beatrice in her magisterial return in the earthly paradise reminds Dante, he must learn to reject the deceptive promises of the temporal world. Despite its harsh regime, the Purgatorio is the realm of spiritual dawn, where larger visions are entertained, whereas in only one canto of the Inferno, chapter 7, in which Fortuna is discussed, is there any suggestion of philosophy? In the Purgatorio, historical, political, and moral vistas are opened up. It is moreover a great canticle of poetry and the arts. Dante meant it literally when he proclaimed after the dreary dimensions of hell, "But here, let poetry rise again from the dead." There is only one poet in hell, proper, and not more than two in the Paradiso. But in the Purgatorio, the reader encounters the musician, Casella, and Belacqua, and the poet Sordillo, and hears of the fortunes of the two Guidos, Guinizili and Cavalcante, the painters Simabuend, Gioro, and the miniaturist. In the upper reaches of Purgatory, the reader observes Dante reconstructing his historical tradition and then comes up even closer to Dante's own great native tradition that is placed higher than the classical tradition when he meets Foroso Donate. Here's explained. In an encounter with Bonaginta da Luca, the true resources of the Dolce Stil Nuovo, and meets the Guido Guinizili and hears how he surpassed in skill and poetic mastery and reigning regional poet Guittone de Arezzo. And these cantos resume the line of thought presented in the Inferno chapter 4. Where among the virtuous pagans, Dante announces his own program for an epic and takes his place, sixth among that number. Alongside the classical writers, in the Purgatorio, he extends the tradition to include statues, whose debate did in fact provide a matter for the more grisly features of the lower Inferno. But he also shows his more modern tradition originating in Guanizili. Shortly after his encounter with Guanizili comes a long-awaited reunion with Beatrice in the earthly paradise.
Dante Alighieri is one of the most important and influential names in all the Europeans. Dante Alighieri was born in Florence, Republic of Florence, in what is now Italy. The exact date of his birth is unknown. Although it is generally believed to be around 1265, this can be deduced from autobiographic allusions in the Divine Comedy. Its first section, the Inferno, begins nel mezzo del camin de nostra vita, or the midway upon the journey of our life, implying that Dante was around 35 years old, since the average lifespan according to the Bible is 70 years old. And since his imaginary travel to the netherworld took place in 1300, he was most probably born around 1265. And some verses of the Paradiso section of the Divine Comedy also provide a possible clue that he was born under the sign of Gemini. As I revolve with the eternal twins I saw revealed from hills to river outlets, the threshing floor that makes us so ferocious. That's in chapter 22, pages 151 to 154 in the Divina Commedia. The basic structural component of the Divine Comedy is the canto. The poem consists of 100 cantos, which are grouped together into 3 sections or canticles: the Inferno, Purgatorio, and Paradiso. Technically, there are 33 cantos in each canticle and 1 additional canto contained in the Inferno, which serves as an introduction to the entire poem. For the most part of the cantos ranges from about 136 to about 151 lines. The poem's rhyme scheme is the terza rima, ABA, BCB, CDC, etc. Thus, the divine number of 3 is present in every part of the work. The setting of the long narrative poem is quite visible, for there are 3, the Inferno, Paradiso, and the Purgatorio. Thus, from the classic, Dante seems to have derived his moral and political understanding as well as his conception of the epic poem. That is a framing story large enough to encompass the most important issues of his day. But it was from the native tradition that he acquired the philosophy of love that forms the Christian's matter of his poem. And that's all for today. That's the end of our discussion about the Italian narrative poem La Commedia Divina Commedia, or the Divine Comedy in English. And I hope you guys go. So that is the end of our discussion about the La Commedia, Divina Commedia, or the Divine Comedy. And I hope you guys cope up and learn something about my discussion. Thank you.